Welcome back to C7, folks. I hope you're holding tight out there and, absorbing all of this extraordinary intelligence and energy from all our incredible guests. And hope your sort of minds are popping with possibility of, and you're being inspired to take all kinds of action for our ocean and for our sort of wider planet. And we're into a panel now, and I've got some amazing guests on this one, and as ever, I've got Johnny Briggs, I've got Anupa Asokan and Professor Callum Roberts, and we're going to get into policies. Now, if you're like me, you might hear this term a lot about environmental policies, and we need to change the policies, and we need this policy, and we're going to unpack a little bit about the importance of effective policy and a policy particularly around marine protected areas, which we've been hearing quite a bit about today. So we're going to unpack that, dive into all that, and we're going to learn more about particularly a campaign that is trying to drive policy shift to protect 30% of our ocean. So on that note, we are going to come to our panel here, and I'm going to invite our panelists to spend a couple of minutes just introducing themselves, a little bit about their work. They're pretty awesome, this lot. They do a lot of amazing things, so we're going to struggle to sort of keep it focused on the policy. It'd just be lovely to know a little bit about you and let our listeners know about your work, and particularly, this moment, 2021, what's the sort of focus for your efforts right now? And maybe we'll start, Anupa, let's start with you, if that's all right.
All right, we're going in alphabetical order here. My name is Anupa Asokan. I'm coming to you from Los Angeles, California. I am an avid water woman. If there's a water sport, I enjoy doing it. A lot of stand-up paddle boarding. I love to surf. I serve on the National Board of Directors for the Surfrider Foundation. And what really got me into the ocean and ocean activism was I've grown up fishing my whole life. That was my first kind of entry into anything ocean related. And it just has really driven this passion that I've turned into a career for marine conservation. I kind of jumped into this 30 by 30, protect 30% of our ocean by the year 2030 conversation. I had been following here in California. There was an effort. There was a bill going through our state assembly specifically for 30 by 30. And with California, we tend to be ahead of the curve on environmental protections. And so I kind of wasn't worried about it. I was focused on some other things for work. And then all of a sudden I heard that it didn't pass because the fishing industry stalled it in our state Senate. And I got real fired up and I wrote an op-ed because as a fisherwoman, I didn't feel as though the fishing industry groups were representing my perspective. Because I really think that protecting 30% of our ocean at least is essential if we want to keep fishing and enjoying the ocean in the way that we do into the future. So it's a very quick overview related to 30 by 30, but I can't wait to talk a little bit more about policy and how to get engaged.
Amazing. Thank you. Johnny.
Thank you very much. So I'm Johnny Briggs. I work for the Pew Charitable Trust, American organization, but I'm based in the UK. And I'm lucky enough to work with, so the UK and its overseas territories, they've got the 5th largest area of ocean under their jurisdiction on the planet. So my job, I'm so lucky, I get to kind of work with the UK and their overseas territories to try protect as much of those waters as possible. And I've been at Pew for about 6 years now, and I've just been on a real journey with these overseas territories. So, if you go back to 2015, due to a groundswell of kind of public pressure, the Conservative Party put a line in their manifesto that said, we will create a blue belt of protection in our overseas territories. And we've been on a journey since to try define that and hold them to account, basically. What does that mean? And due to a lot of, pressure on Ps, working with different ministers, etc., since then, the UK and its overseas territories have designated some of the biggest marine protected areas on the planet, Pitcairn Islands, Tristan da Cunha, Ascension, to the extent that they've now protected 60% of their waters and feel emboldened enough to try and motivate the world to protect at least 30% of their oceans. So it's been a fantastic journey and an extremely fortunate one. And I'm looking forward to talking about it some more.
Amazing. Thank you. Over to you, Callum.
So I got started in marine science in the early 1980s. And by the late 1980s, I got a PhD in coral reef fish ecology. And I loved watching fish and seeing all the great things that they did with one another and trying to unlock the secrets of their lives. But then I started to travel a bit and go to more places that had been not as well looked after as some of the ones that I saw in the first place. And I started realizing that we were having some big impacts on the sea. And early on in my career, I got a chance to study some marine protected areas that were protected from all fishing, not just a little bit of this or a little bit of that. And I was stunned by how many fish there were in those protected areas. We had to look really hard to find them, as in find the protected areas to study, because there were hardly any of them at the time. Far less than 1% of the ocean was protected then. And I wondered, you know, if these things are so great, which they were, why aren't there more of them? Why is it that everybody's just fishing out places and pulverizing them and with trawls and dredges and destroying areas that had formerly been very rich? And so I was, you know, one of my professors said to me, if you want to make a difference, you're going to have to make sure that you don't just write about this, but you actually make sure people read about it and act on it, because there's no point in just embellishing a library shelf with a study that has no relevance to the real world. You know, if you're going to go and do conservation science, you need to make sure that conservation science gets put into practice. And that's why I'm interested in policy.
Amazing, thank you. So let's dig into policies. As I said, we've got all kinds of folks listening in today, and you know, many of us are seeking to understand where do we act, where do we put pressure, how do we make sense of all this complexity and all these crises. And we hear, obviously, you know, if you work with policy, you get it. But for many of us, it's just sort of noise, and we recognise it's important. You know, it's an important thing. It's connected with power. But it would just be lovely if we could just unpack it a bit. Like, what are they? How do they work? And how do you change? How do you sort of create policy ask, and how do you change them? Whoever would like to pick that one up to start with, but I'd love to hear from all of you.
Oof. I think that we live in an era where policy a lot of times is driven by messaging. It's not necessarily driven by what's best for everyone as a whole. It's the story that you can tell based on the laws or the policies that you enact. So my advice to you, if you want to dive into ocean activism in particular, is to tell your story, right? Folks like Callum are finding the hard science and the research and the data to back up a lot of the things that we've witnessed as ocean users, right? Like, I can tell you that the waters off of the California coast here have warmed by 2 degrees Celsius, but I can also tell you the story of how I don't see kelp the way that I used to. All of our kelp forests are gone. I'm starting to see tropical species when I go out for a stand-up paddle that I've never seen around here before or never expected to see around here before. Telling those stories to our policymakers, like, they want to hear from you. It kind of adds these anecdotes and these, I guess, more relatable stories to tell that back up the data and all of the information that they get and hear every day.
Thank you, guys.
Johnny, after you.
Thanks, Callum. So I'd say policy is really an approach adopted by government to solve certain problems. And as Anupa says, like, some policies might tick more boxes, and some might also resonate a bit more with actual politicians because they might be a bit sexier. So, you know, the things that you've been discussing all day, really, you know, which are causing the degradation of the ocean, overfishing, habitat destruction, climate change impacts, you know, oil and gas exploration. You know, what we're talking about here with 30 by 30 is marine protected areas. And that is a policy that ticks a lot of those boxes, as in it helps to, if they're implemented effectively, can kind of counter a lot of these problems. And it's also a policy that, you know, governments quite like. You know, they can easily talk about these things. It's basically designating national parks in the ocean, which allow biodiversity to flourish. So some policies are certainly sexier than other. If you think of perhaps the UK Prime Minister might like policies like that rather than more complex ones, such as, you know, how do we really work on fishing quotas to end overfishing, which is, you know, equally important. So I think as Anupa said, you really need to sometimes think what resonates with the party, the politician that you're targeting, and also which carry the biggest impact.
Got it. Callum.
So another angle on policy. Policies are what governments do, to enact their promises and to make us all prosperous and to, suit their party donors and so on. And the Scottish government a few years ago decided that it would promote the rural economy by increasing the amount of salmon farms by 100%. So they were going to double the size of the salmon farming industry in 10 years. What they didn't think about was whether this was a really good idea, because it could have some negative impacts on other things that people also value and enjoy. And one of those is beautiful, clean sea lochs, for example. Now, if you put a hugely polluting salmon farm right in the middle of a sea loch, the salmon will be happy because they like the clean water, more or less clean water. But the people around the sea loch who suddenly start seeing their pristine loch becoming murky and filled with slime and all sorts of dead zones forming on the bottom because of all the pollution coming from those salmon farms, they're not at all happy. So you can have governments coming in thinking for the right reasons, that there's a need for jobs in remote areas, but making mistakes in terms of their policy. Now there's a need for a new policy in Scotland which addresses the problems that salmon farming has created. And quite often policy making is a sort of iterative process whereby you kind of implement an idea and then you begin to reap the consequences of that, and you realize it might not have been such a good idea in the first place, and you're lobbied by all sorts of people wanting to change what you're doing. Some people want you to keep on doing what you were doing, and you have to make a decision as to what you're going to do and which policy you're going to follow. So I think, we in the sort of ocean science and activism community are trying to get governments to implement good policies for the environment, for the oceans.
Amazing. So let's talk about 30 by 30. Like, who's involved? What's the kind of thinking around it again for folks listening? And where is it? What's its current status? If anyone wants to share.
I'm happy to jump in. So there's a push at the moment, initiative really called the Global Ocean Alliance, which is led by the UK. And what they're trying to do is push for a global agreement on a new ocean protection target through a global treaty called the Convention on Biological Diversity. And the target that they're pushing for is at least 30% of the ocean to be protected in MPAs and something called other effective conservation measures by 2030. And decisions on these targets over the next decade is going to be agreed at a meeting in Kunming in China in October. But with a lot of these things, a lot of the work is really done beforehand. So what the UK is trying to do is get as many countries as possible on the record saying that they support 30 by 30 on the build-up to this meeting, so they can build as much momentum as possible to get it over the line. The way that they came up with that figure was due to a lot of different scientific publications, and Callum actually produced one of the key ones, which first said, if we really want to replenish the ocean, we need to protect 30% properly in effective MPAs. We also got to think about, obviously, what we do in the other 70%, that's got to be managed properly. We can't be degrading that, or that will offset all the good work we're going to do from 30 by 30. But that's the movement at the moment, and that's what the international community is hoping to achieve. And if you get that, it then puts the spotlight on countries to actually deliver it. And it does work. People start looking at the UK, at France, and saying, well, what are you doing to contribute to this global target, which actually stimulates good policy, as discussed before.
And is there appetite globally for the? Are lots of countries stepping into this space? Like, give us a sense of like who's
So
playing.
we've got 80 at the moment. So there's the UK has its Global Ocean Alliance, and kind of confusingly, France is leading something called the High Ambition Coalition, which asks for a very similar thing. So 80 countries so far have signed up in support of it, and a lot of quite big ones as well. So it's certainly moving in a very positive direction.
Yeah. Anything else you guys want to add on the 30 by 30 status?
Well, I think, I think it demonstrates the importance of doing good science and playing a long game here, because I first started asking the question, how much of the sea should we be protecting? I mentioned that we were protecting hardly any. in the mid-1990s when I was trying to study the first marine protected areas. And so I asked, how much should we be protecting if we want to achieve basic things like protecting the full spectrum, the full variety of nature? And the answer wasn't a few percent, it was a few tens of percent. And we published a paper on that in 2003. It came out coinciding with the World Parks Congress in South Africa. And when I was there, somebody sort of tapped me on the shoulder and said, hey, why don't we make a recommendation to come out of the conference on this? And so we did, and the recommendation was passed. We should be protecting 20 to 30% of the sea. By 2014, another World Parks Congress comes along, and they firm the target based on the new science that's emerging to at least 30% of the ocean needs protecting. And then we published more science on it, and that was cemented into a resolution at the World Conservation Congress in 2016. And that's really when this thing started gaining legs. And many NGOs like the Pew Charitable Trust came in behind that figure and started to really promote it across the world. And that's when the politicians begin to take notice, because they can ignore things when it's just a little noise in the background. But when there's this kind of concerted push from many organizations and people together, and it makes good sense intuitively, protecting 30% of the sea is not a big ask, really, is it? We need to protect enough of the sea that's going to make a difference to the rest. So I think that's when all the cards start falling over and everyone falls into line and says, yeah, that's a great idea. We should have been doing that all along. So policy making is staying with something for the long game. Things don't happen overnight.
Something that's really encouraging to me about the 30 by 30 conversation, I think, is like from this grassroots perspective, we're starting to see an understanding of the value for nature as it is, right? Not just what we can take from it, the fish or mining for minerals in the deep sea or things like that, right? I think we all heard from Easky Britton earlier. She talks a lot about the health benefits of, being in the ocean, and we want to be in a healthy ocean as well. So, as an ocean activist, we can get behind the idea that like we value a healthy ocean environment that we can play in, that we can be a part of on this planet, right? So I think that's another key piece of the 30 by 30 conversation that I'm really encouraged by.
So you've got, as far as I understand, we've got about 7% of the ocean is currently protected, roughly? Is that about right? And I guess, yeah, well, give or take. But so this shift, like, I guess, there are, in a binary world, there's going to be losers from this shift, right? So what's the blockages, like, and where's the tensions really in making this happen? I'm guessing it's all money, and so, but give us a sense of where the battles, if you like, are happening, and because I think also just to understand how, if we're to get over this, if we are to have this sort of global cooperation, it's kind of also rather than the sort of the losers and the winners, it's how do we help these other sectors particularly, how do we help them evolve out of these spaces, or what are the sort of transitions, I guess? So I was just curious to give us more of a sense of like what's really going on, how complex is this, where are the sort of big tensions, and who are we talking about? Big question.
Well, the fishing industry is one of the big tensions, right? Deep sea mining is kind of emerging as a big topic area and a big point of conversation as well. But I think at the end of the day, it's looking at a short-term gain for a few people versus long-term benefits for our planet as a whole. And I think if we can really focus on that piece of it, it's a no-brainer. We need at least 30 by 30, right? And I'll let Callum and Johnny add on to that. Yeah,
I think as Callum intimated, if you follow the science, this 30% should actually be in fully or highly protected waters. So where you've hardly got any resource extraction or human activities. But, with that, you're going to have losers. There's going to be economic loss. There's going to be the arguments of job losses. And the UK is a perfect example of that. As I said, it's doing really, really well with its overseas territories, where these places are highly isolated. You don't really have any industries exploiting the waters. So it's a lot simpler to work with the local communities to designate large, fully protected areas. If you look at the UK's domestic waters, they say that quite a bit of it's in marine protected areas, but really only about 1% meets international standards. And that's because you've got so much industry working there. And there's not really been much movement from government over the last couple of decades to basically fully protect those waters, which would potentially alienate some of those groups. So you always have that conflict, unfortunately, and that's what tends to play out.
But there are ways that protecting the ocean will provide benefits in the surrounding regions. And this is something that we've seen time and again across the world, is that the fishing industry doesn't actually lose out, except that it has to reconfigure. So, if you fish less, you'll end up building up those populations. And so you can catch more at less expense because there are more fish and it's easier to catch them. It's just a time thing. There may be a short-term dip as the life rebounds. So I think, much of the time, fears that are aroused among people about a new marine protected area being created turn out not to be true. They're unfounded. The fishing industry in California said when it designated 20% of its state waters as marine reserves, that this would shut them down. Well, no, it hasn't. And, quite a lot of those people are quite happily making money off the back of the bigger fish and the more fish that are around as a result of this good policy.
Yeah, our lobster fishery catch increased by 225% since those marine protected areas were enacted about 10 years ago. It's amazing.
It is. Who knew, if you don't kill things, they become more numerous and they reproduce more prolifically. And it's good. It's good for the ocean. Fishermen need fish if they're going to have a living. And ultimately, the industry has been eating itself over the years because they haven't protected fish enough. So to get a healthy fishing industry, you need healthy fish. That means that 30% by 2030 is in the fishing industry's interest.
And I guess there's a lot of complexity, isn't it, that sits under this, because money is being, subsidies are sort of funding a lot of these sectors, and it's a question of, again, what where could you put that money? Even things like, the conversations around things like universal basic income. How do we support people to actually not extract, not, just how do you, because we have this kind of response to everything, which is, well, people need jobs and, they can't feed them. But actually there are creative ways to think about this where we're facing right now. Are you seeing any signs of that, or is it still quite binary?
I think you see signs in that the question of long-term sustainable financing for marine protected areas is coming in more and more, and how you develop sustainable blue economies. As we said, if you actually designate a large marine protected area where you don't have extractive industries, well, that local population is going to miss out potentially on revenues from licenses. So where is that money going to come from? How can you develop sustainable tourism? How can you potentially bring in an endowment fund? Can you maybe get some sort of blue carbon credits from protecting certain ecosystems like mangroves? People are thinking a lot more creatively about long-term financing angle for sure.
What should we should be worrying about? We're hearing a lot about deep sea mining, and again, it's joining the dots on these things, because obviously we sort of go, oh, it's these it's the corporations, but ultimately, we're looking for metals, we're looking for our sort of desires around technologies and electric cars and all the stuff that no one really wants to talk about. But actually, there is something in all of this as well about how do we evolve a little bit here, right? Because it feels like we're going to have to let go a little bit of this this desire for more accumulation.
I think that's certainly true. I mean, with deep sea mining, one of the problems is that it's very attractive to mining companies to go mining in the ocean, because nobody's going to be displaced by that. It's not going to go and pollute some village somewhere. But the problem is that containing the impacts of deep sea mining is going to be incredibly difficult. It's potentially going to travel thousands of miles instead of being contained in a relatively small area in a terrestrial setting. So it's a really, really bad idea. And in fact, what we should be doing is thinking creatively about how to get those minerals that we need, those elements to build the stuff that we want to use, you know, to move to a zero carbon economy, for example, from other sources that are more sustainable. I just read a couple of days ago about a technology to extract lithium from seawater. Well, that's the sort of thing we need to be pursuing, not going for easy mineral deposits that are sitting there in incredibly fragile ecosystems. You know, what could possibly go wrong when you put a mine down there?
Well, and building on that a little bit as well, like we don't even know what all of the impacts might be, right? We don't even have accurate maps of the areas where we're looking to extract these minerals. So it's difficult to say, go ahead and do that when we don't even know the long-term impacts on us as humanity, right? So that's what worries me about that.
So we got lots of one of the themes today, I guess, throughout C7 is we're trying to open up this whole idea of activism. Like there's many ways for people to start stepping into, you know, serving these crises that are everywhere, right? And there's all forms and different ways of doing that. And we've been really trying to sort of open it up. When you're looking at things like the work you guys are doing with MPAs and the 30 by 30, what can people do? Like, how can more people support what is going on beyond, I guess, clicking things? I guess that's important. But like, what's your sense of where energy is needed?
You elect your policymakers. They work for you and they need to hear from you. So don't be afraid to send them a letter, call them. There are numbers you can look up online. You can email them. There are great organizations like Surfrider Foundation, for example, that make it really easy for you to connect with your policymakers. And they even give you the tools to be able to speak to them effectively, or take you to Capitol Hill if you're in the US. There are Surfrider kind of affiliates and chapters all over the world. So that's one great organization that can kind of help you, you know, feel empowered and give you the tools to be able to talk to your policymakers, because they really do want to hear from you and they need to hear from you. They're hearing from industry. So it's up to us to kind of speak on behalf of the ocean and the space that we love to recreate in.
I'd agree 100% with Anupa there. I think writing to your local politician is deeply underrated. In fact, it's essential to do that because they act on the basis of what they think their constituents are interested in. I heard from a politician in the UK that he'd only had 2 letters about climate change in the last 6 months. 2 letters. So it was something he didn't really need to worry about. You know, climate change is not on my radar. Well, it should be on people's radar, you know, and I think that people can shut down all this sort of activism that's going on, or protest banners or whatever. But if you get the direct route to your elected representative and you push their buttons, I think that then you might see some more change happening. And this is a particularly good time at the moment to do it because there are many big decisions about ocean protection coming up.
Johnny.
I was going to say, I think also that, you know, locally, and we might see this in the UK at the moment, we were talking about it before coming on, that, you know, there's a push to trial new marine protected areas in UK domestic waters. And, you know, the kind of dissenting voices, they organize pretty quickly and they shout pretty loudly about why these things are a bad idea. So to organize locally, you know, in support of these things, you know, the fact that the revenue, you might not lose revenues, tourism might develop, sustainable fishing might improve. So to kind of engage locally, I think, and have your voice heard to counter the often kind of critical voices from industry is very important as well. As Callum and Anupa said, to actually show your politicians that there's 2 sides of the story.
Amazing. Listen, we're nearly out of time, so we've been finishing. It's been fascinating. So thank you for all of your wisdom and knowledge and inspiration. We've been finishing with this question. You know, G7's happening just down there here in Cornwall. If we, you know, we're going to get you in tomorrow for an hour with the G7 leaders. What's your message? What are you going to tell them?
So oh yeah, go for it. Sorry.
I was going to say, don't forget about the ocean. It's a great and important solution to a lot of the climate issues that we're facing, right? Restoring the oceans, protecting 30%. These are all proven, you know, we have facts that back it up, that can be a solution to our climate crisis.
Sure, yeah. I think 30 by 30 is really important, but protecting those areas highly from human damage and harm is as important. There's no free lunch. You know, you're not going to create recovery of marine life if you don't give it a high level of protection.
Amazing.
And I remind them that the G7 environment ministers met last week, and they produced a communique that said the G7 supports 30 by 30. Well, it's the G7 countries that can really push to have that agreed at the CBD, and then can actually work to deliver 30 by 30 through, for example, designating protected areas around the Antarctic, or pushing for a treaty that means you can protect the high seas. It's in their hands, basically.
Johnny, Anupa, Callum, thank you so much for your time and all the incredible work you do. And thanks for joining C7 today.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.